O tēnā tātou, nau mai hara mai ki tēnei kōrero, I te tuatahi, me karikia tātou, no reira whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hi aki ana te atākura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, ti hei mauri ora.
Hi, salam everyone, kia ora. Thank you for joining in for today's panel, which is on women of colour in the public sector. As we open our space with a karakia to ensure our hui begins with a blessing, we also want to take this time to acknowledge the many recent events that have happened in Aotearoa and around the world. We want to acknowledge that the pandemic has been a great time of stress for everyone around the world, and we want to mihi all of the people in Aotearoa for playing their part in stopping the spread of the virus, and in particular, our friends in Auckland who are taking one for the team in ensuring the virus is maintained and stopped. We also want to acknowledge the victims of the Linmore incident, which occurred last Friday. Violence has no place in Aotearoa or anywhere. This attack was a choice of an individual, but one person's action does not define a whole group of people. We pray that those affected have a speedy recovery and that we look out after one another to make sure that everyone in the community continues to feel safe. We would also like to acknowledge the situation in Afghanistan and those who have now made Aotearoa their homes. Refugees used their bravery to survive where sometimes they had no choice but to leave their homes and start a new life. Please make them feel welcome and reach out to them if you're able to do so. You're able to help refugees resettle in New Zealand through your local Red Cross. These events and kaupapa are the very reason work like this continues to be important. It is crucial for us to unite in the face of adversity and tragedy and continue to play our part in creating a more peaceful and inclusive society to be good ancestors for our legacies. Secondly, Dar es Salaam, also known as House of Peace, is the organizer of this event. They were founded in 2019 and run by the small team of Shema and Rana Arif and Alzina Shamim. Their objective is to empower ethnic rangatahi in Aotearoa and enable them to achieve all they hope to despite living in the diaspora. This is done through various engagements and workshops, which addresses issues and interests that impact our youth, such as today's event. So now it's time for the facilitators and panelists to introduce ourselves. Hi, my name is Nurul Shamsul and I'm originally from Malaysia and Indonesia, but I've been living in New Zealand ever since I was 5 years old. Before COVID, I was working at a women empowerment organization in Malaysia called Institute Wanita Budaya, and now I'm doing my master's in public policy at the University of Auckland. I am super honored and grateful to be a co-facilitator as we are graced with such amazing, phenomenal women who will share their experiences and wisdom in today's panel. Over to you, Arama.
O tēnā tātou, he uri tēnei no Maniapoto, ko te tōkanga nui a noho te marae, i te tau o tōku koraua ko Ngāruahine, ko Taranaki iwi, ngā iwi, ko oi o te marae. So my name's Arama, I'm from Taranaki and also from Te Kuiti, and my background was in research and in academia, and I've recently become like an independent academic. So a lot of the kōrero that we go through tonight about what we experience in institutions, I haven't worked in the public sector, but working in academia, I'm sure there are some parallels that we can draw. But yeah, I'm free now, so ka aroha hoki kia koutou.
Kia ora koutou. Vanakkam in my mother tongue Tamil. No inia aho, ko kasi te iwi ko air te hapu, ko somasheka raua ko Parvati o ku matua, e noho ana raua no inia. Ko Joby Matthew toku hoa rangatira, ko Advet Matthew taku tama, ko Sri Priya Somasheka toku ingoa. I'm Sri Priya Somasheka and my pronouns are she, her. I'm from the South Indian state of Tamil Nadu. I moved to Aotearoa 9 years ago with my husband and son, who's now 12 years old. Overnight, I became an Indian woman in India to an Indian woman in Aotearoa, and nothing could have prepared me for that move. What that meant was not only was gender a visible part of my identity, race was too overnight. I started to have experiences that made me question my worth as both a woman and a person of color. The barriers I faced saw an intersection of race and gender. The looks I got when I wore my Indian attire, when I was asked if I knew what Google was, when I was casually asked to change my name to Susan. The list is endless, and I'm sure we'll get to it later. I have 2 masters from India, and I pursued my PhD at Waikato Uni in community psychology. My thesis focused on Indian migrant women and their experience of family violence in Aotearoa, the key findings of which have informed policy and legislation here. This material is also widely used in training and to inform further research. I worked in family violence and sexual violence prevention in the public sector before moving to MB to shape and lead the inclusion and diversity kaupapa. My role at MB is to influence change by making MB a more safe, trusting, and inclusive place for everyone to work in. In both areas of violence prevention and inclusion and diversity, I quickly realized that the voice of women of color is often absent. My goal is not only to make space for these voices to be heard, but also to amplify them at the right level. I'm really honored to be a part of this panel, and I thank you for giving me this opportunity. Ngā mihi nui, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Kia ora nā koutou katoa, ko Agnes toko ingoa, ko Te Paeru toko māma no Aotearoa, ko Ioane toko pāpā no Samoa. Malo lelei, everyone. My name is Agnes Sefo. I work for the Ministry for Pacific People. I've been in the public sector for 30 years, initially starting off with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and then I spent a large part of my career at the Ministry for Social Development. And then recently, I went to Ministry for Pacific People in October last year. I grew up in Wellington. I was raised a Catholic, did all of my schooling in Wellington. I studied at Victoria University. I have a master's degree in public management. I live in Porirua, and I absolutely love being part of the Pacific community in my professional and private home life. I'm looking forward to this evening's discussions, looking forward to listening and sharing with all of you, but also really looking forward to learning from the conversation that happens and sharing from my fellow panelists.
Kia ora koutou. I think it might be Manisha's turn.
Sorry, I wasn't sure if it was my turn yet. Thank you. Kia ora and gamcho. Ko Manisha Bika Tokuingawa. I'm a Principal Policy Advisor in the National Security Group at the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet. I work in security and intelligence policy. I joined the public sector a long time ago, back in 2004, at the age of 24. You can probably work out how old I am based on that, when I was working on my MA thesis, which I did on the idea of children's rights and its influence on the policy development process. I'll tell you a little bit about my career journey backwards. So before I joined, I've been at DPMC for coming up to 2 years now. Prior to that, I lived in the UK in London for about 12 years. I worked in a range of roles in primarily local government, but local government and central government, policy and strategy roles across social cohesion, community safety, preventing violent extremism and hate crime, and emergency management. So a lot of my experience, actually, I realised I'd spent about a third of my life living in London before I returned. But a lot of that time has also been working in local government as well. Before I went to the UK, I worked in the public sector here in New Zealand, and I worked at the Office of the Children's Commissioner as an advisor, and I advised on issues to do with children's rights, particularly for refugee and migrant children and young people, and youth participation more generally. Before that, I was at the Human Rights Commission. I worked in a couple of different roles there. One was as a race and ethnic policy analyst, and I also worked in the Equal Employment Opportunities Office. I spent my time, actually, I think, in those early formative years in my career working in human rights and civil liberties. And I think that that's really been a huge influence on my perspective as I kind of fell into counterterrorism work, but a really important perspective, and also helps me think about sort of race and gender quite a lot in my day-to-day work. I'm Indian, I'm Gujarati Indian. My family have been in New Zealand quite a long time. My great-grandfather arrived back in 1917 on a boat. My grandparents were deeply involved in the Indian independence movement. So there's been a history of kind of activism and radicals, I guess, in my family, and they have really influenced and shaped lots of my values. They were very much people of community, and they had lots of roles in some of the kind of national and local community organisations for the Indian community during their time. I live in Taranaki Makaurau. I live in South Auckland, which I love. I live in a multi-generational household. I have 2 kids that are aged 3 and 5. I'm so humbled to have been invited to kind of share some of my insights and my journey with you today. And I'm also just really excited to kind of learn, listen, and converse with some of these amazing wahine that I'm surrounded by today.
Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Niki Wynn toka ingoa. Magandangabe Salahat. Good evening, everyone. I'm beaming in from Lower Hutt. And I really need to acknowledge how humble I feel to be part of this panel alongside such incredible and inspiring wahine. So very grateful to be here. I am of Filipino and British descent, but I was born in Bangkok in Thailand before my family decided to immigrate to New Zealand in the late 90s when I was 8 years old. Goodness knows why, but they picked rural New Zealand to settle. So I hail from Kati in the Western Bay of Plenty. That's where I went to school. And I like to joke that I had quite a typical progression from school to university because by the age of 16, I was a high school dropout. I recall my school telling me that perhaps I could take up a trade in an attempt to make something of myself. And I think that was a reflection of just the wild and sort of destructive path that I was leading at that age. So I worked in hospitality for about 4 years. I left home at 16 as well, because as you can imagine, there's not really many opportunities to work as a young person in Kati. So I worked in 2 jobs, in cafe in the morning, making sandwiches and coffee. And then in the evenings, I went and worked night shifts at a restaurant. For some reason, at the age of 20, I decided to go to university. I don't know why, but I decided to study law, which I graduated with a law degree with honours in 2014. And yeah, at the age of 20, I guess you didn't need university entrance, so there were no real prerequisites for me to go and study. And I guess, you know, despite being out of school for so long and having only achieved NCA level 1, whatever that means, and the premise that I was never really supposed to amount to anything, I graduated with an honours degree as a first-generation university student. My first job was as a Crown prosecutor, so I entered the criminal law in Palmerston North, which I'm sure there's no surprises when I say that I was the only young woman of colour working in that sphere. I have some hair-raising stories about my time there as, you know, in terms of issues pertaining to race. And so by the time I'd done 4 years there, I felt like I had well and truly done my dues, and you couldn't have got me further away from that scene. So I moved to London, where I held a couple of roles, one including with undercover policing inquiry, where I was investigating infiltrations into far-right extremist groups, and that was a real eye-opener, to say the least. After a couple of years in the UK, I was due to move to The Hague in the Netherlands to take on a role with the International Criminal Court in their trial chambers. And this was just at the beginning of 2020, when COVID was amongst us and starting to unfold. And, you know, unfortunately, we really saw a rise in xenophobia, racism directed towards the Asian community. And at the time, I was, you know, in contact with expats on the ground who were already settled in The Hague. And it was very saddening, and it pained me to learn about people being under attack just by virtue of their ethnicity. And actually, one of the main reasons why I decided to stay and to settle back down in New Zealand was because I felt like for the first time in my life, I had to really seriously consider my safety because of the way that I look, and because of the, you know, I'm sure that the political rhetoric and discourse by certain world leaders was very unhelpful at the time. But yeah, so that fast forward some time, I came back to New Zealand. I worked for the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse and Care, where I was investigating the state-run residential facilities for boys and girls in terms of historical abuse. And I very, very recently joined the Human Rights Commission as a senior legal advisor. Kia ora.
Oh, kia ora koutou. Lovely to hear more about the really interesting trajectories and amazing work that you've all done. So I'll kick us off by just kind of setting the scene for the conversation we're about to have. So there was some data released in 2020 about the ethnic diversity within the public service. It found that 65% of the workforce was Pākeha. That sounds fairly reasonable. That's fairly close to their proportion of the population. But when you look at senior leadership positions, Pākeha comprised 92.1% of the workforce. Obviously, when you have that many people of one ethnicity in the workforce, you're really running monocultural institutions. And there's a real danger, not only because women of colour, people of colour can't progress in those institutions, but also what kind of work are these institutions producing? What kinds of communities are they serving? And so that's why a conversation like this is really necessary. Some of the common experiences of people of colour in the public sector include discrimination and recruitment practices, experiences of not being able to progress, having people kind of promoted ahead of them. And then there's also the question of the racism that people experience through those kind of day-to-day interactions, as well as the structural stuff, microaggressions, biases, these types of things. And of course, there's the pay disparity. So across the board, we see there's a gender pay gap, but this is kind of exacerbated for people of colour. And the way that ethnicities tend to be recorded in New Zealand, kind of grouped into these large groupings, we see that Pacifica people are paid far less in the public sector than other peoples. And so this is just completely unfair. So we're wanting to kind of talk about some of the issues that people have experienced in the public sector. So what we'll do is we'll begin by having a kōrero. Nurul and I will ask the panelists a series of probing questions, and then we'll follow that up with questions and answers at the end, because we're already seeing lots of lovely comments coming through. So there will be plenty of time to address some of the questions that we received tonight. So I'm going to hand it over now to Narul, who's going to lead a discussion about some of those like really early experiences. So even perhaps before you get into the public sector, even just trying to get in can be a challenge. So I'll hand it over to you, Narul.
Yes, definitely. Yes, I am currently doing my master's in public policy. So it will be really interesting for me once I do apply for these type of roles within the public sector. So my questions that I'll be doing right now is based on recruitment, and this is for all the panelists. So what advice would you give young women of colour or young people of colour in general in Aotearoa who might be feeling a sense of hopelessness of entering the workforce and the public sector because of their identity? Do you want to start off, Nikki? So this is for everyone.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Narul. As I, as I heard that question, I'm really thinking about my early years and trying to enter the legal profession. So a lot of my perspectives and my experiences are relevant to that in that context of the legal profession, which is in itself quite impenetrable. So now I'm in the public sector and I'm very glad that I am. But, at the start, it was quite difficult to land a job that I felt like I should be able to get and, was competitive at. And despite the fact that I had, relatively good credentials as a graduate, I found it quite difficult to get a job. And just a really quick anecdote of, one of my first experiences at interview stage for a job that I really wanted and was, very sought after and very competitive, was I was basically subjected to very blatant racism during the interview, in the sense that, and I won't bore you with the details, but in the sense that I was basically told, so this is the culture, this is what you have to do to be able to fit in. And for example, how would you feel about this sort of black humor? And then made a joke that I was the subject of, that was very sexist and racist, and it basically compared me to an Asian famous actress. And at that time I felt like, oh gosh, okay, we're used to towing the line, I think, as women of colour who are trying to get in to the jobs that we want or the positions that we want. And I'm ashamed to say now, at the time I just went along with it in the sense of like, oh yeah, no, I can fit in here, don't worry about that, you don't have to concern yourself with me putting my head above the parapet or whatever. But looking back now, now that I'm in the public sector, it's a space where I feel a lot more safe, and I can be my authentic self. So I don't think that really answers your question, but in terms of like feelings of hopelessness, I think everyone on the call will acknowledge that the road is always going to be tough when you are a person of color, and especially when you bring in other intersections, it gets more complicated with gender, race, disability, and etc. But there are communities out there, and I wish at the time when I was coming out of uni that I felt part of a community, but I didn't, and that's why this webinar is so timely. And I think it's about realizing who your allies and your advocates are going to be, and really relying on them. As it's symbiotic. We can rely on each other and lean upon one another and seek advice and counsel. So yeah, sorry, long answer, but yeah, that would be my advice.
Thank you so much for your advice. It's really shocking to hear that they would be blatantly racist to you during the interview question, expecting that you should be able to handle it when you shouldn't have to in the first place. So I can see a couple of people raising their hands. I think I saw Priya raise her hand first. Yeah, so you can go first, Priya.
Good, Narul. Thank you for that. Thank you, Nikki, for sharing your experiences. And I'd like to tātoko that in terms of when I came to New Zealand first and, completed my PhD. This was after I had 2 masters in India as well. There was the employment agency that I went to register, basically first asked me to change my name. And they said, there's no way you're going to get a job with that name. And I thought it was a joke, laughed it off, went to another agency. They gave me similar feedback about my name. And they backed it up with research, which unfortunately is true. And one of them asked me if I had my driver's license, and I wondered if it was for a particular role. And they said, oh, you know, you can drive an Uber if this is not going to work out for you. This is, again, despite me having a PhD, right? So, and yes, that definitely adds to your sense of hopelessness in a country where you already feel isolated, you're away from your whānau. And when I came here 9 years ago, I didn't know anybody when I arrived. So, you know, trying to start from scratch in terms of your social networks, your professional network can be overwhelming when you're in your late 20s, for instance, or even, you know, even when you're younger, it can feel overwhelming. What has helped me through that is to know that it's not normal to feel that way, and to be okay to feel that way when you do. And secondly, to know that you're not alone in this, that there are other women of color and other people of color who have similar experiences. It's not the exact same story, but they all have a story to tell. Because let's face it, our ancestors or us, we're here as people of color to build a better life for our future generations. And in carving that path, there are barriers that we have to overcome. So you're not alone. And like Nikki said, always keep an eye out for allies and talk to other women of color and who you feel safe with, and, you know, share that solidarity with them, because sometimes you can get stuck in your experiences and in your head feeling like you're insane for feeling a certain way or for interpreting the situation a certain way, when more often than not, it is quite true what you're feeling. So I reckon it's about finding your allies, finding people you trust, and sharing these experiences.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. I think that you're so brave having to come to New Zealand and having to start all over again. Like, it's easier said than done. And I'm really glad that you're sharing your experiences, because you're honestly paving the way for other women as well in the future. I think I saw you raising your hand up next, Manisha, so you can go next.
Thanks, Meryl. I guess one thing I think I've noticed in New Zealand, and just comparing the difference after working in London as well, is New Zealand is so small, and the public sector is small as well. And I'd encourage you, and it's something that I just think quite often people of colour, we don't have natural professional networks or parents that were necessarily professionals, so we don't understand how to navigate like the system of applying for jobs and like how to behave and how to apply and all of that. What I'd encourage you to, and I look back with hindsight, like the first jobs I got, and they were always through connections, and like, but in ways where like my lecturers at uni had said, go and have a chat to so-and-so and like find out a little bit about this kind of policy work if you're interested in it. And what I'd encourage people to do is just to keep like reaching out, sometimes even to people that you don't know, or like reach out to other women of colour, but also equally like people that are not women of colour are also great allies as well. So don't limit yourself to just women of colour, but find ways to just ask people if they'll go for a coffee with you, that you want to just find out a little bit more about the sector. And even if that doesn't go anywhere, your actual kind of coffee meetings, like you might find like one day in the future actually that relationship might be of benefit in some different way. And I just encourage you to build professional networks. It's something that I think we don't necessarily like just see around us when we're people of colour, because we don't necessarily see this as much like in our families or the people that we're surrounded by. But I think like networks is so important, and kind of understanding like what roles you want to be applying for, but also just to how to navigate the system as well.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing that, Manisha. So yeah, I definitely agree to that. I feel like it is really easy to feel hopelessness, especially if you're applying for so many jobs and getting rejected and not getting any feedback at all as to why you didn't get the job. But it is super important to like find allies and to reach out to people. And for me, I feel like a motto that I have is like to never be afraid to ask for help. because there are actually people out there who are willing to help you and they actually want to see you flourish. So yeah, just go ahead and reach out, because you never know, they probably will want to help you. So now, Agnes, it's you. You're up next.
Thank you. I agree with all the advice that the panelists have given. Just something that I think as individuals you might want to just not go for every job in the public sector, but you want to be selective about the organisation that you pick. And you might want to do a little bit of homework about whether or not that organisation's values resonate with your own. So, you know, there's a little bit of pre-work that you need to do before you put yourself out there. And further to that other feedback, you might want to talk to someone about who you might know that works for that organisation that you're trying to get a job in. And you might want to ask them questions about what's the culture of their organisation like? How do they treat people or women of colour? What is their diversity and inclusion policy? You know, those sorts of questions, so that you get an understanding of whether or not that's the right fit for you. Another thing that you can do is prior to going for that job interview is, if you're getting knocked back, part of building your resilience is understanding where you're getting knocked back. And it could be investing in some interview coaching or some career counselling to match you to the job that you may have discounted, but it actually aligns so well with your skill set, and you might be able to find that organisation that aligns with your values. Their values are the same and align to your own. Once you're in there, you really need to find who's your tribe, who are the people that are like you, that can walk alongside you, where you can build that trusting relationship with and share your experience. And maybe you can start your own network, so that people who are new to the organisation don't find it as difficult as yourself to assimilate. And you can contribute to the conversations about more inclusion, what your experience has been, and make that pathway for somebody else joining a little bit easier once you're in. That would be my advice.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Agnes, for your advice. Just something that I would like to add to this conversation is that I know that it is very difficult to find a job, and then when you're feeling hopeless, sometimes at the end you also feel like you're not worthy or that you're not enough or something. But sometimes it's about if that opportunity is like worthy enough for you, and sometimes you may not get that job now, but there's actually something better for you later on in the future. So don't give up on hope, and just continue and like persevering and applying for jobs that align with your values as well, because sometimes we do forget that when you do start working, like it's a career and it's most of your life as well, so you actually have to enjoy working in that workplace as well. So off to my next question. So in today's society, organizations have tried to be more diverse. However, this could just be at face value and could lead to tokenism and trying to fill the diversity quota, where an individual is seen but not heard. How can a person of colour navigate around this so that their contributions are recognised? Do you want to start off, Agnes?
In trouble with the buttons. Sorry, can you please repeat the question? Sorry.
Okay, no worries. Yeah, I can repeat it again. So in today's society, organisations have tried to be more diverse. However, this could just be at face value and could lead to tokenism and trying to fill the diversity quota, where an individual is seen but not heard. How can a person of colour navigate around this so that their contributions are recognised?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And in my own personal experience, I've felt sometimes that inclusion on a board or a group has been because I am Pacific, not necessarily, and it is to fill a quota, and not necessarily because I have a valuable contribution. And so that has been a challenging situation to find myself in, and one where you feel like you have to work doubly hard because you need to be able to demonstrate that you have a value contribution to make, and it might be to enhance outcomes specifically for Pacific, or it might be on a broad range of issues, not for me personally, for me on a broad range of issues that impact the general population, or on a topic of interest. Yeah. So anyway, I feel like the way to do that is you do have to prove the point by being there in some ways. You have to be blind about it so that you can just focus on the topic. That is, and you bring your whole self to the conversation and not worry about what the feeling of being tokenistic. You need to take the emotion away from it and contribute to the conversation. Be very focused and back yourself at every conversation so that people realize that you have got something to offer. And it's more than just your color, it's what you bring to the table, your whole self. That would be my advice around that.
Awesome, thank you so much. That is very empowering. Does anyone else want to contribute to this question? Okay, no.
I just completely tautoko what Agnes has just said, and I just quickly add that, just building on the point that you've made, it's so important to feel a sense of self-worth and actually believing in it, because you're not just there for a box ticking exercise. And if there's ever any inkling that might be the case, and that you're there to fill a quota, and the company or the organization is simply paying lip service to diversity, then that's also something that you may or may not wish to address, because you can't have diversity without full inclusion. And the reason why you tend to be there is because you have lived experience, which is so important. And it may also, be engagement or community channels that only you can bring. And so you're 100% supposed to be there, and it's not a tokenistic thing.
Okay, awesome. Do you want to start our next section, Dr. Arama?
Oh, I just see that.
I'd just like to,
I'd just like to
quickly add to that, is that in an organization, there will be one or two leaders who we can rely on. And, even if as an organization, we feel like diversity is, inclusion and diversity is a tick box exercise, there will be champions in the leadership team who we can rely on. So I would say, reaching out to them and having a corridor about your experience, or, getting some guidance from them. And also seeking mentorship outside of your organization is really important. So if there is an opportunity to talk to senior women of color, or, senior leaders who understand your experiences in order to guide you in the right path, that would be really useful, because otherwise it will feel quite isolating and frustrating being in an organization where you feel like you're there just to fill the diversity quota. So it's about how else do you fill your bucket in order to contribute where you need to meaningfully.
Awesome, thank you so much.
Yeah, it's really difficult hearing phrases like having to work doubly hard, because I think it's something that probably many of us can relate to, where we might be in a position, but we're viewed as being, whether it's a diversity hire or not, it usually isn't, but there's still that impression that your colleagues might have, that you're only in the position you are because of your identity. It just reminds me of when I was a student studying psychology, and people used to say to me, oh, you should apply for clinical. You're Māori, you'll get in. And it's like, I also have the best grades in the class, but that part of it's kind of excluded and not focused on. And Priya, as you were talking, it was just reminding me of the experience of so many migrants who are told at the interview, process, oh, you don't have New Zealand experience, and it's almost like code for not wanting to hire migrant women or migrant non-women. And I think what that totally obscures is all of the value that your experience as a migrant person, as somebody who has connections and experiences in different communities, could bring to that role. Like whatever organisation you're working in, particularly MB, having that migrant experience is a massive asset. And yet sometimes when we go for these roles, those types of experiences and knowledge are not valued in the same way as your degree or your previous placements and other work. In fact, I remember sitting around a table with MB people who work in immigration, and they were describing how they designed all of these migration policies, and then were just really flummoxed that migrants didn't behave in the way that they had expected them to. And then looking around the room, it was almost all Pākeha New Zealand born people, with perhaps two non-white people who were very junior. So yeah, just all of the amazing wealth of knowledge that we can bring to these roles are often overlooked. So I'm going to move into the next section, which is around just the general challenges that we might face in the public sector as women of colour, presuming we get in the door in the first place. So the first question is around, what are some of the challenges that you face as at that intersection of being both a woman and a person of colour, and how have you managed to navigate those types of challenges? It's quite a general question. Priya, would you like to start us?
Yeah, happy to go. When gender and race intersect, creates specific and quite unique challenges for women of colour that are too often overlooked. And I think for the most part, women of colour resort to what we call code switching to try to fit into white spaces, by adjusting or adapting their behaviour, appearance, and language to avoid highlighting the negative stereotypes that kind of exist in these work environments. And I do that on a regular basis with my accent, for instance. So what you're hearing here is not my Indian accent that I use at home. The way that I present myself, for instance, what I choose to share with people about what I do over the weekend. I think I persevere against it by trying to be who I am when I feel it's safe to do so around my people. I find my allies in the workplace who make space for me to be myself. I think the other aspect, the other challenge, and I'm talking about challenges that are not overt, they are quite understated and subtle. And the other one is gaslighting, right? It's another common experience for women of color in the workplace and people of color in general. And my question always is, how do you create agency to speak on a matter that others don't even see as a problem? That's half the issue when you're a woman of color, because others don't experience what you're experiencing. They don't validate it. They've never experienced it in the same way. And so they think women of color created this experience in their mind. And that's the narrative given, we start to believe it. This is also an experience that I've had and continue to check myself on as well regularly. And what has helped me in this aspect is to find trusting people who I can share my experiences with. And more often than not, they've experienced it too. And that validation is everything. It reassures you that you're not making things up, and what your experience is what you're experiencing is real and valid. So for instance, if I say, oh, when I walked into the elevator, someone looked at me a certain way because I was wearing something. And another Indian woman would say, oh my God, I felt that too, but I thought it was all in my head. I'm so glad that you've spoken about it. So I think it's about sharing stories and feeling validated in your experience of being a person of color.
Thank you. Such an important thing to raise here. I've seen a lot of people kind of jumping in the comments around the code switching and really kind of relating to that. It's certainly been a feature of my life. I remember, just like, you hide your taonga and stuff when you go to school because, you're trying to manage the way that you're being perceived, which is terribly sad. we've talked about assimilating into workplaces and code switching and not being able to bring our authentic selves to all the spaces that we're in. And, you know, like while we can share strategies around how we deal with it, it's also just obviously really important to acknowledge how bad that is and how that's not okay, and we shouldn't have to be doing all of this work. So yeah, thank you for kind of sharing your survival techniques there. I also wanted to just bring Nikki in around experiences kind of transitioning from the private sector into the public sector, and you know how allowed you are to be your authentic self in those different spaces.
Oh, it's so black and white. I mean, the story that I shared about one of the first interviews that I ever did in the private sector is in stark contrast to the most recent one that I had, in which I felt like I was able to actually say, you know, you should hire me on the basis of my diversity and my lived experience, and the fact that I actually have you know, that I'm an expert in certain areas, which is very important to this job by virtue of my ethnicity and my experience. But I think, you know, building on what Priya was talking about in terms of code switching, I think one of the main challenges that I really had, especially in the private sector, but I think I still operate under this sort of predicament, is what's called stereotype threat. And so that's basically a situational predicament in which people are or feel themselves to be at risk of conforming to a stereotype about their social group. And so I was only really made aware of this recently by someone who I consider to be a bit of a mentor. And it really contributes to longstanding racial, gender and racial gaps in performance. And in the context of being, you know, a young Asian woman in the legal profession who was regularly appearing in court, it was a major challenge that I found myself trying to dispel all these stereotypes about what people may perceive me to be like. And when you think about it's working that doubly hard, it's making sure that you're completely over prepared. It's making sure that you establish very early on that, in fact, yes, I can speak English. I do know what's going on. And I am like as competent as my typically middle-aged, you know, Pākeha male counterparts. And, you know, it may sound extreme, but I was once in a court proceeding where, after oral submissions, a judge who I think knew me quite well because I'd appeared in front of him so many times in the past, and his oral judgment referred to me as Ms. Wong throughout. And, you know, the ripple effects that happened in that courtroom at the time, you know, I was giggling and people obviously found it funny. And how do you say that code switching, stereotype threat, the way in which we operate as people of color isn't a thing when stuff like that happens? Because, you know, stuff like that is your worst fear, because you immediately feel humiliated. And I guess overcoming that is, I guess, in part, it builds on your resilience. But then when you have days like that, you think, actually, I don't want this test in resilience today. Just today, I would like to forget about the fact that I look this way or that my face doesn't fit, and just be seen for whatever it is, substantive work that you've got to do. So it's saddening to think that a lot of us operate in this way, because underlying everything, I think at the end of the day, the ultimate goal or hope is that we just be considered equally to others. And so that, I think, is really important. And it really helped me to learn about this stereotype predicament, because it kind of provided an explanation to this way that I was operating under that was very harmful, I think. And if you read the literature on stereotype threat, it can cause, you know, trauma if it goes unchecked. So it's really important to understand how you might be trying to conform to impress or fit in or appease others, and make sure that you keep it under check. Especially for one's mental health, it's so important. Thanks,
Nikki. That's such a great kind of framework to use to describe some of the ways we might feel in different contexts. Yeah, it really sucks that we have to be constantly viewing ourselves from the outside understanding that anything we do will be interpreted perhaps with these types of lenses. So if you're late for a meeting, if you're unprepared, you're not allowed to have a bad day, because that will then be kind of attributed to your race. Just talking through some of these issues, it's just reminding me just how difficult this work can be. And often we go into these types of roles with really good intentions about wanting to make a difference, and yet it's almost as though the institution is operating in a way that thwarts our efforts. And some of the work that you've described being involved in, across the board here is really, really full-on difficult work, like the inquiry into abuse in state care, for example, when you might be working for this institution that is violent, that is predatory, that is racist, and you're there to try to make a positive difference. But, like you said, some days you're just not there for it, and it can feel like you're stuck in this, eternally damned to push the rock up the hill like Sisyphus. And we often want to make transformative changes to the institutions that we're working in, and yet often our roles limit us in what we're able to achieve. So I wanted to ask around how do we try to stay motivated in these institutions that are often viewed as really harmful to our communities, and when we don't necessarily have power to make sweeping changes to those institutions. And Manisha, I was wondering if you would be able to respond there.
Yeah, thanks, Arama. And actually, what you were just saying about kind of the how it makes you feel when you're trying to progress really meaningful and important change, and sometimes things that you at a personal level are very passionate about and driven at a very personal level, like in your professional life. I think that it's incredibly challenging. And I know I've had kind of many moments over like my career in the different kind of roles that I've been in, and particularly in working within kind of the counterterrorism, the security, and sort of preventing violent extremism space. I think one of the challenges I've found is, like, I come from a community and like friends that are advocates and activists, and many of them have held me to account, like at a personal level, like challenging me why I'm working in this space when, some of these are programs that are deeply flawed and at times systemically racist. And like many times, like had to, I guess at a personal level, like talk about like why I'm driven to continue staying within these kind of programs of work, because I'm there to, like, some of us have to be there on the inside within the system, like chipping away for change. And like our perspectives, and particularly as women of color, are really important. And I notice this now, and I see, after being in my role for 2 years, I have to remind myself of the impact that I'm having, even if it's just the small wins or the smaller things. Like, as we're trying to do like the big kind of system change piece, like that stuff is that's the marathon. And like we have to keep reminding ourselves of the kind of the small moments that we can kind of celebrate some success along the way. And equally, I think, like I have those friends and family who, will be like, will challenge me about like some of the work that I'm involved in. But I think equally, those are the same people I go to when I'm really tired from kind of the things like code switching and like trying to navigate that system from within it. And I go to those same people to fill my cup. Those are the people that remind me why I'm doing this, and they're the same people, like we have the same values, and we're like trying to kind of seek meaningful change in kind of the different ways that we're trying to do that. But those are the same people that I go to fill my cup, to spend time with. And I think one of the things we have to do is just remember who are those people in our lives that like hold us to our values.
Thanks so much. I'll hand over now to Nerul to talk about as you progress, hopefully, through your career, some of the challenges that you might face.
Yes, thank you. So yeah, I will be talking about progression. So many young ethnic people these days suffer from issues like imposter syndrome and tall poppy syndrome. For those that don't know, tall poppy syndrome is when people are resented, attacked, or criticized because they're seen as successful or superior by those around them. Have you had any experiences with this, and what would your advice be for the younger generation to overcome this? So Agnes, I would like to ask you this question.
Sure. Well, I think imposter syndrome and tall poppy syndrome can happen to anyone, no matter what your age. Yes, I've experienced imposter syndrome. It's natural when you're starting a new job or a new program of study or something new that challenges you. Could be exercise or a new hobby where you feel intimidated because you think you're not confident or worthy. You should acknowledge that's how you feel. And in my experience, when I start something new, it becomes my new obsession, where it's interesting and different. And then I focus on what I think about the new situation I'm in. And then I think, okay, what am I going to do about it? And the main thing that's worked for me is that I get busy about it so that I can build my knowledge base about what's new about the job or the piece of study or the hobby, so that I can build from that baseline. Then once I start to feel more competent about it, I take stock and I realize actually, worrying about the imposter syndrome, the reality is not what's happening in my head, but what's actually really happening in real life. So at some point, you can't dwell on it for too long. You need to back yourself to get in there and get stuck in. For me, being pragmatic is useful. Talking to others is useful, and keeping in the business, if you're making a change in work or career, is a good way to stay active and less time in your head, or in my head, worrying about imposter syndrome. And before you know it, you're in the flow.
Awesome. Thank you so much for advice. Another thing I would like to add is that, sometimes we think that it's a competition with other people, but it should actually be a competition within yourself so that you can get better. And then when you focus on yourself, you actually get more ahead than if you were to compare yourself with other people. So Manisha, do you have anything else that you would like to add to that question?
No, actually, I don't have too much. I'd probably just say, like, imposter syndrome is very common, I think. And I know that I've experienced it like throughout my career, but more so, I think, in more recent roles. But I think over time, one thing you realize is like, no one really knows what they're doing. And everyone is winging it. And once you realize that, I think it's something that just gives you a bit more confidence in yourself, and that your opinion and your perspective is just as valid as anyone else around the table. And I think, I think what I would say is just always back yourself. And, in those times when you're kind of nervous or not sure about your contribution or what you're thinking, there's always opportunities to sense test with others. But I think it's just a matter of building that confidence in yourself and your ability. And once you realize actually everyone else is just winging it too, I think that you realize your space is just as valid.
Yes, definitely. 100% agree on that. Adulting is really hard. And I realized growing up, everyone is just on the same boat. They're just trying their best and then they're just hoping that it actually works. So the next question is, what are some of the experiences or challenges you faced during those big transitions in your life? And was there ever a moment where you felt completely hopeless before breaking those barriers and pushing through to reach where you are now? Do you want to answer that one too, Manisha?
Sure. I'll talk about, so we had made the decision to move back from the UK to New Zealand, and it was due to family health reasons, and so we'd made this decision to move back at quite short notice. So I was applying for jobs in New Zealand from over in the UK, and I thought I had tons of experience, like really valid experience, and I was applying for lots of jobs and not even getting shortlisted, and it was really getting me down, actually. And so I guess I want to just say, like, this is a really common experience, and you'll find it at like all different times in your career. And I persevered, but it was really hard. And I think at times, you know, I wasn't looking forward to the move. And then I ended up having an interview for the role I have at the moment, probably just like a month or so before we were about to move. And I found out 2 days before I had already booked our flights and planned the move, and 2 days before we were going to leave, I found out I got my role, which was great, and it was really great news. And it was, I guess that's one of the really difficult transition periods in my life, like moving countries. And but I had accepted this role, and I was moving back to Auckland, but the role was based in Wellington, and I had decided to commute down to Wellington from Auckland Monday to Thursday, and I was moving back without my partner, and I had a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old. We were living with my parents, and so I was flying down to Wellington like Monday morning, like on a 6 a.m. flight, and then I was coming back on Thursday evening, and it was incredibly difficult. And I guess like I was very lucky to have the support of my mum, and I think like I absolutely value all of the strong women in my life, and they've been such tremendous support along the way. But my mum, absolutely, she's kind of been I don't know, like one of my key supporters the whole way through. So I think whenever something looks hard at the beginning, if I have her support, like I know I can get through it. And it was definitely hard, kind of, I'd chosen a really hard way of trying to settle back into New Zealand through kind of this new job that I'd taken, and this commuting cities. And I wasn't even sure if I wanted to work in central government here in New Zealand, or if it was the right kind of role or job for me. But I think what I would take from all of that is that like always take those risks and always back yourself, and find ways, like even when things look hard or you're despairing, like something will always fall into place, and it will be the right thing, and it will be the right role. And this ended up being like absolutely the right role for me in terms of my expertise and experience. But also when things look hard, if there seems like a way that you might be able to do it, like always take the chance, like always take a punt on yourself.
Yes, definitely. There are so many strong women out there who does like a lot of sacrifices for the family as well, so that they can also have a career and spend time with their family as well. So Nikki, did you have anything that you want to add into that as well?
I think one of the biggest lessons I learned in life was, you know, I at the start of my career, I was all about my career to the point of burnout. And one huge event in my life was my dad passing away while I was working as a Crown prosecutor. And, you know, it was like, for me, that was one of the worst things that could have happened in my life at the time. But because I was so career focused, and I don't know, like working under this perception that I couldn't take much time off work, or that I had to go back to work to get through things and assume that things will get back to normal. You know, years on from then, I've learned now that we as people are not just about our career or our job. And I've really learned where to place my energy and value in. And so now I place value in my relationships, my family, and things that bring you so much joy in life, because that's not just work for me. I think it used to be, but yeah, it was really damaging for me to, you know, I think in total I took 10 days off. My family live in Katikati in Taranaki, so, you know, quite a long way away. And 10 days after taking some time off, I went back into trial mode, and I was doing back-to-back trials, and one of the first trials I did when I went back was this like really horrific sexual abuse case against a child. And so no wonder, you know, that it's really not helpful to do that to oneself. So I'd completely advise against that. But, you know, during this korero, whilst we're talking about work and careers and progression and, you know, climbing up the ladder, those things are important, but also the things that you place value in, like relationships and family and other things that bring you joy, that's what makes your life whole, you know. And so it's just really important to keep that in mind, because the job will always be there, no matter what point in your life you're in, but those other things may not be if you don't place enough energy and time into them. Thank you.
Yes, well, that's so true. I guess like timing is everything. Things will happen at the right time. And it is really important to not just focus on your career, but things outside your career as well. So leading to that, what are some tips on having like a good work-life balance? Do you want to give some tips, Nikki or Manisha?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on that. I think I really value the time I spend with my kids, and when I am with them, I try and just like switch off entirely from work and just be very much just with them. And I think that that's a really some conscious and very intentional decisions that I think I've made over the last probably like year or year and a half or so, is to kind of disengage entirely from work when it's the weekend. Other than anything, I guess that's like high priority or urgent. But I think it's really important to, you know, when you're spending, in terms of work-life balance, the bits that are life, to make sure that you like 100% are kind of in the moment and like spending that time with your kids. I think that point that Nikki made around, you know, your career work will always be there, it will, but you know, like our kids are only this age, like for this period of time, we're only kind of like, you know, we only have like 18 summers when they're at home, and to spend those summers with them. And I think some of that kind of stuff is really important, and to kind of prioritize family time and also community time and the things that, you know, are important to you within your community and outside of work. I think like it's very important for work that you're filling your cup outside of work so that you can be good and like your best self, like in all of your other areas of life as well.
Yes, definitely. I feel like in order for you to really show up, you really have to take care of yourself. Priya, I can see that you got your hand raised up.
Thank you, Nero. Work-life balance, that's a tricky one for me, I must admit, mainly because inclusion and diversity is my life. It is who I am. It is how I operate. It is what I do. That is what I live and breathe. It is my experience. It's all of me. So like Manisha said, over time, I think I have realized that I have to carve out some intentional time to do things that are not work related. However, that lens always stays on, right? When I go on a holiday, I see gender around me, I see race around me, I can't not see that. It's just about how I deal with it when I do see that. So I don't go straight into my strategy in my head or what I need to do at work. I just unpack that for myself. And that really helps in terms of reflection, and it helps me also then take it to work when I'm ready to do that. So there are a lot of people of color who do work like this, which is all encompassing. It is who you are. And I think you have to work doubly hard to make that sort of distinction. So yeah, you know, doing really small and silly things with your family and doing some big things for the community and everything in between. So I've seen that. I'm still in the trial and error mode. So if anyone finds the answer to that, do let me know.
Awesome. Yes, that's really good advice. So I think, Arama, do you want to lead our next section, please?
Sure. Yeah, I was just, when you were talking about work-life balance and families and these types of things. I really liked some of the phrases that were used around, like, you really value your time with your children, you really value your time with your community, even though capitalism doesn't, right? And we're kind of gaslit by capitalism that, you know, the only positive contributions we can be making is when we're being productive at work and we're getting paid for it and we're contributing to the economy or something. And when we're talking about, like, the experiences of women, obviously that type of labor, that unpaid labor, falls heavily on us. And so it's yeah, you know, somebody said working doubly hard. I also read some statistics around how women who are mothers are paid on average about 10 to 14% less, I think, than women who have no children, because the employer expects that we'll take more sick days, or that expects that we won't work long into the evening and all of these types of things. But then I've also seen a figure that the ASB Bank was sharing at one point, saying the most productive people in their workforce are women who are mothers working reduced hours. So it's not that we don't do as much work as others, it's just we do it faster because we've only got so much time and we want to be home with our families. And just bridging into the conversation we're about to have, it's unfortunate that being caring, the caring roles that we take on, Nikki, you talked about, like, your father and, you know, those types of roles that we might play, that they don't seem to kind of be valued in the by our employers, and yet they're so crucial often in the work that we do. And we're going to start talking about leadership positions now. And I have to say, I'm not a natural born leader. Being the youngest in my family, I never had to lead, but I certainly learned a lot about leadership when I had a child, you know, because yeah, you have to be very good at creating a shared vision, motivating people when you're a parent. And my mum is a bit of a boss. She's listening. My mum's a bit of a boss in the public sector herself, and she says that she learned everything that she knows about leadership through raising 5 children, and that adults are just the same as children, and that they need their gold stars. So imagining that we do get our feet in the door, we do progress through different positions in our jobs, and we enter into these leadership positions. When we looked at that statistic at the beginning, that over 90% of the people in senior leadership positions in the public sector are Pākeha, it really paints a really difficult position about our likelihood of getting into leadership roles. And I've certainly seen that in academia, where, you know, the university might say, like, oh, we've increased our Māori staff by 20% or something, and yet in each kind of faculty there's still one Māori professor. There was one Māori professor in the 1980s, and there's one Māori professor in the 2020s, because there almost seems to be these, we call them brown ceilings, where the institution can only tolerate so much success from a brown person. So when we do enter into whatever level we're at, positions of leadership, we often find ourselves being the only person of colour kind of at that table. And I wondered if anybody had any experiences around leadership, or around the competition that might occur between people of colour, between, in particular, women of colour, to get into those senior jobs, and whether or not you've experienced, like, any kind of lateral violence or competitiveness in your workplaces because of that, or just the challenges of being a woman of colour in a leadership position. Would anyone like to speak to that?
I'm happy to go. Where do we begin with that one? I think, first of all, when I entered this position, I did not believe it was a leadership position, because that's what women of color do. You know, even when you're given a leadership position, it takes a while for you to believe it's a leadership one, and also to believe what that entails. So one of my earliest memories of this position is when I was in a meeting and people turned to me for my opinion I literally pinched myself under the table because I was like, wait, they're looking to me for an opinion. They're actually asking me a question. This is huge. And then when I started offering my opinion and started telling myself, actually, here's a space where I can tell what I'm thinking rather than keeping it in my head. And then you start hearing at least, say, 10 or 20% of the people leaning in. That is positive reinforcement for you to, be like, wow, they're actually ready for this. And I think that's what I've come to realize is that, and in corridor with other women of color, I've realized that we think a lot of things that we don't say because we think that it's incorrect or that it's inappropriate. However, if we make that step, we'll be quick to realize that actually that opinion is valid and it is appreciated in many, many forums. So I still definitely have moments where I think, no, I'm just going to shut up and not say this because it's rubbish. However, if I told that voice to be quiet for a bit and I made that move, I've never regretted it. So I think it's about being bold and brave. It is about being courageous. The onus is on you a lot of the time if you're the only brown person around the table. And I would say it's totally worth it because, it's about those baby steps and you see those changes around you little by little. You start hearing changes in language. You start hearing people applying that lens next time they talk about that subject, and it's all worth it.
Thank you. Agnes, would you like to talk?
Sure. It's really funny because, this bit's not funny, but the next bit will be. I think leadership happens at all levels. Doesn't matter what role or what title you hold. If you're asked for your opinion and you're asked because it matters. And being a woman of colour, if I'm surrounded by people who are not the same colour as me, I use it as a competitive advantage to be able to sell my point and to focus on what the topic of conversation is. Because I will speak if I feel totally confident about the issue. But also the other thing is when you're in that sort of leadership role, you also have a responsibility to create a pathway for others. So really you're growing tomorrow's leaders today and you're leading by example. And so you really do have to back yourself to be able to hold the floor or the conversation or to ask the hard questions and to challenge the status quo. So in doing that, you're demonstrating and you're role modeling and challenging in a constructive way so that you can keep the conversation going. You don't want to kill it, but you do want to be able to ask the hard questions, but also to raise topics that are uncomfortable and to be okay with being uncomfortable so that people can understand what are the issues that we're really talking about. And by growing tomorrow's leaders today, you're showing and demonstrating that it's okay. There is no wrong question to ask. If it matters to you, it matters, and that's okay. And so in terms of women of colour, you should really be backing your sister. If somebody says that they want an opportunity to sit at the table or to share their viewpoint, back her and hold the space so that she can have the same opportunities as yourself. Doesn't matter what role they have. Get them in the room. Doesn't matter how old they are. They could be talking amongst people who are older or younger than themselves. And that's where I think thought leadership grows at all levels, at all ages. Doesn't matter what the title is. And so I think it does matter when you're a leader that you start growing that pipeline and giving others the opportunity to talk.
Thank you. I just had a question coming on the chat, which was asking about the percentage of the population. So the percentage of the working age population who are Pākeha is not anywhere near 90%. So Pākeha are definitely overrepresented in senior leadership roles within the public sector, just to clarify that point. Thanks, Agnes, for talking about how we can do things to support other people who might be kind of minoritized by the institution that we're working in. When I was lecturing at Victoria University, it was so amazing. The Māori staff really came together a lot at that institution, and you know, even though there was this competitive dynamic where only so many people get promoted in each promotion round, one of the coolest things that happened there was all the Māori staff got together and we created a cartel where everybody sat down and helped each other with their promotion applications. And just that kind of, you know, that complete rejection of this, like, no, we're not going to do what you want us to do, and like, you know, dog eat dog, have a really competitive structure. They all decided to work together. So it was really cool. Did anyone else want to add anything on leadership? I saw a hand go up, but I think it went down again. So, oh, yep, Manisha.
I just wanted to add, I probably haven't experienced any of the kind of competitiveness across with other women of colour, and I'm grateful for that. If anything, I think like I'm trying to get more women of colour because I work in such a monocultural space at times, and I'm doing all I can to kind of make sure I'm kind of encouraging colleagues to think about how to recruit better for increased diversity. The thing I recognise that what Arama described as a brown ceiling, and I think it's really challenging and something that I've kind of thought about quite a lot, I think, over the last few years in my career. Before I left the UK, for a few years, I was in a BME, like a Black and minority ethnic leadership mentoring program, which the organisation that I was in, the local government organisation, recognised this challenge as well. So they had a very structured mentoring program where they matched mentees with leadership potential with those in very senior, like tier 1 and tier 2 and tier 3 roles, in order to facilitate both formal and informal mentoring. And I think about the relationship that I had with my mentor, who was like a white male but in a leadership role. And one of the benefits of that relationship is effectively like understanding from someone like who, you know, the system is designed for, exactly how to navigate that system and get to positions of leadership. And he was able to kind of help me with job applications as I was writing them to review and things like that. And even just the conversations we had about kind of career development and where I wanted to be, what are the things that motivated me in thinking about my career. What I would take from that is that people like him and other people along the way in my career that I would see as mentors are really important. So I would encourage other women to reach out to people that you're interested in establishing a mentoring relationship with, or just more informally want to learn from, and especially those that are in leadership roles, because there is something about needing to know, like, it's not something that we all like naturally know or understand, but how to navigate the system in order to reach those roles of leadership. There is a ceiling, and it's challenging, like, for women generally, and then we have the added kind of intersectionality of race as well. And I think that there is something about trying to understand how that system works and how to kind of like build your career and kind of find out what those pathways are. And lots of that is from people that are already there. Reach out to those that are already within those leadership roles who you want to learn from.
Thanks for that, Manisha. As you were describing the kind of intersection of being both a woman and a woman of colour, it reminded me of how diversity programs are often captured by white women. And I'm not sure if that's a dynamic you've seen played across your organisations. I know it won't be happening at MB because Priya's onto it. But yeah, certainly a lot of the institutions that I've been involved with put on these like diversity programs, but it's really just about being a woman. And then you look at who are the women attending the program, and there are no Māori women, for example, attending those programs. And we don't attend those programs because for us, our experience doesn't align with just being a woman in a workplace. It's about our experience as Māori women. Yeah. Just thinking about where we're at with our conversation. We're chewing up a lot of time because you're all full of such great advice. So I might pass over now to Nurul to talk about what inspires you and what further solutions we might be able to offer into this space to improve our experiences as women of colour in the public sector.
Okay, so yes, we're in a bit of a last bit of section. One of the questions that I want to ask all of you guys first is, what have been your greatest or proudest moments for you during your time in the public sector? I'm just looking at my panel. Do you want to start us off, Nikki?
Well, thanks, Nurul. I think this probably cuts across both the private and public sector for me, but it's always been, I think parts of my career to date have always related to engagement with communities, especially, well, in my case, having worked with victims of horrendous crime, survivors of abuse, and survivors and affected whānau of attacks. It's been one of those things that I find to be the pinnacle of my career, because I think there is, unfortunately, within the legal profession, I think there is a tendency to look at lawyers of being quite pale, stale, male, using very sophisticated language, not being able to relate. And I'd like to think that the proudest moments in my career have been being able to make connections with the most vulnerable and marginalized people within our communities and actually feel like I've made a difference. And especially when you get that feedback from people saying, oh, you know, you've made something that was a really complex process or a very difficult process a lot easier for me. And yet definitely that is probably something that I have a lot of pride in, because it's unfortunately not very common for lawyers to be able to put a lot of the book smart stuff aside and the technicalities and just bring things like care, compassion, and empathy to the forefront, particularly because, I guess, because of my lived experience, my background, my ethnicity, there is just that natural ability to be able to relate with, you know, people who are the most vulnerable or marginalized within our communities. So there's many times where in my career where I've wanted to stop being a lawyer, and I've regretted studying law in the first place because of what the profession can feel like and what it looks like. But it's been those moments in my career where I felt like, no, this is actually the reason why I'm here. And so that's very validating for me. It's very humbling, but also it brings me the most, a massive sense of that I'm doing rewarding work.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that, Nikki. Agnes, do you want to share what's your most proudest moment, please?
There've been a few, but one of them that I can remember is many years ago, I had this role of being a case manager at Work and Income. And that's a tough gig. You know, you're giving a lot of yourself and your time to people who are way more vulnerable and who need your help, and they wouldn't be presenting unless they really needed your help. And this woman who was a solo parent, she was trying to she was wanting to enroll in a nursing degree, and I just took a little bit of time to help her, talk to her, and then you know, that was done and dusted, and then she went on her merry way. And then it was probably about 3 weeks later where I was out socializing with my friends in a pub after work, having a drink, and then she bowls on up to me. I barely recognized her, and she gave me a big hug, and she was really happy because she got into her nursing degree course. And, you know, just seeing that that was years ago. It stayed with me because it's actually about making a difference to someone's life, and maybe creating an opportunity where, you know, they're on their way just because you took the time and you really spent, you know, I knew how much it meant to her. And she didn't have to come up to me afterwards, but the fact that she wanted to made a huge difference to me. So that has stayed with me. That's probably one of my most proudest, that I actually made a difference to someone, and she's, you know, got this career out of it. So that's, yeah, I think that's probably one of the most humbling experiences for me that I've enjoyed.
That's awesome. Sometimes you just like never know that something that you did for someone is actually so big to them, and it's very life-changing as well. So that's awesome to hear. So Manisha, you're up next.
Thanks. I've had a few, and I was trying to think as the others were speaking, and one of them is just very similar to kind of Nikki's, around kind of building trust with communities, and the work that I've done over my career working with communities and helping them to build trust in programs that they didn't have trust in previously. But I did want to talk about a specific kind of example, and I was working in London in a London borough within local government, and we had developed this framework, and it was basically for decision making for when there might be proponents of hate, so hate preachers or extremist groups or speakers who wanted to kind of hire venues or be in venues in our local area. And we developed what was like a really difficult piece of work, but how to kind of make decisions around those that were promoting messages of hate and intolerance. So it was a really great piece of work, which helped us to take really difficult decisions. But there was a few times coming into London, there was a group called the English Defence League, which is known as the EDL. It's a far-right organisation, lots of kind of white football lads kind of guys. They had decided to organise a demonstration in central London, and they were going to come through our borough. It was based in King's Cross. And as they all got their trains in from outside of London, they had decided to stage a demonstration in one of the areas of London with significant like populations of Muslim communities. And so they would be passing through our borough, which had a lot of the main London train stations in it and a lot of pubs around those train stations. So what we decided to do, and I managed to kind of, I guess, convince and influence some of the decision makers in the local authority I was working in, was to write to all of the pubs in the local area to encourage them to not host these individuals in their pubs. And it was a huge success. So basically we had a whole lot of pubs, and they're very, very busy inner London pubs and big drinking spots that were all just rejecting all of these far-right English Defence League, like, I don't know, big white guys with the bald heads, kind of, you can imagine the types that they were. They were very angry. They were kind of all over social media about their anger at not being served a pint in lots of these pubs. And one of the things that made it really significant was just afterwards, like we had significant populations of Muslim communities in our borough around the King's Cross area, and many of them wrote to us and said, thanks so much for the great work that you did in keeping them out of our neighbourhoods. So that's like one kind of example that I found, I kind of always reflect back on that, as sometimes it's hard to kind of convince people like of taking hard calls and hard decisions, but that's one time that I feel like it made a real difference, and I could see the difference it made to local communities.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that experience. I think it's really important that each and every one of us like do our role to make sure that people within our community are feeling safe as well. So that's really awesome that you managed to do that. Priya, can you share
very much.
Example?
I think in the first few years of completing my thesis, I started to see how it's translated into policy and legislation and in training and things like that. And I've also had, Indian migrant women come up to me and tell me about how my thesis has helped them leave an abusive situation, and those kind of stories I hold very close to my heart. I am proudest when I have conversations with individuals and groups who tell me how the changes that we're looking to bring about in the organization that they're actually working, that they feel more seen and heard, that there's more inclusive language being used, that they feel safe and have a sense of belonging in the workplace. And, you know, I've had people tell me at MB that in the last 2 years, they've seen a massive shift in the way that they experience MB as an organization, that they can actually feel that the inclusion bit is at the heart of the mahi, and it's not just about diversity, because as we know, culture change is all about that ripple effect, right? It's just about that one person having that conversation and then going home and having that conversation. And it's not just about the workplace, it is about our communities that we serve as well. So I think it's just about, I'm proud about those drops in the ocean that I hope that I'm contributing to.
Yes, definitely. I'm sure you are definitely contributing to that. Like, I think most of us don't realize how much of influence you can actually have on other people. So it's amazing to see like all of you guys being a good role model and leading the way and making it easier for everyone else as well. So I think that's it for this section. And now we're going to be moving to our Q&A. Arama, would you like to lead that, please?
Sure. So I've got a really interesting question here from Lisa, who asks, how do you think junior women of colour can address institutional racism within their workplaces successfully without becoming alienated, frustrated, and eventually leaving or being asked to leave? And I don't know if our panelists are familiar with Sarah Ahmed's work, but she writes extensively on complaint and what happens when you make a complaint, whether that's about sexual harassment or racism, which are kind of the areas that she tends to focus on. But what she points out by interviewing women who have made these types of complaints in organizations and tracing the complaint, she points out that what happens when you raise the problem of racism is that the institution will make you the problem. So it becomes about you being unprofessional for raising this. It becomes about you being angry or bitter or not taking people's comments the right way, not playing along, not laughing at the joke. So it is such a tricky terrain. The other thing that Sarah points out in her work is that if you lay a complaint about institutional abuse, what you can expect is more institutional abuse. And so I think that would be my caution to anybody who has an issue around racism and raising it, is that, you know, just because we can see that this needs to be addressed and see it as a really important issue doesn't mean that your institution is going to want to deal with that really big and important issue. And I'm sure you'll have like nuanced responses about how to do that. But I guess the first thing that would come to mind is that, is there a way of framing this as a breach of the organization's kind of values or something like that, instead of necessarily calling it racism? We should be able to call these instances of racism out, but it's sometimes difficult to do that in a way that won't leave you exposed to more racism and more institutional abuse. So that's kind of my 2 cents on it, but I'd love to hear what our panelists have to say about that.
Arama would totally, I want to echo what you just said, and just to add to that, absolutely, yes to everything you said. And I think it is, so at MB, we've started a conversation about race. And I think that is absolutely pivotal for us to have across public sector, is to talk about race. We talk about culture and ethnicity till the cows come home. We don't talk about race. When you talk about race, you have the permission to talk about racism. And when you talk about race and its impact in everyone's lives and not just people of color, then you actually understand concepts of power and privilege and what you can do with that. I'm not saying that we've fixed everything at MB, but we've started a conversation, and our senior leaders attended the workshop, and then there's ongoing conversation, and now up to 500 people have attended this workshop about race. what that does, and I think young people, you know, they are so full of energy and they're so bright, and I don't think we should be dimming that light. That energy that they bring in and talking about race and racism in the workplace, absolutely important. I would say keep going. And I would say again, it feels like I'm repeating myself, but yes, find your allies. There will be leaders who will listen to you, who will lean into the conversation, and who will help guide you from within on how to actually navigate these systems and talk about it at the right level in the right way, so that you understand the organizational readiness while getting your point across. And that's something that I've learned over a period of time and continue to learn at MB is I can say certain things in certain forums, but I'll have to change my language in others for it to get through. And that's fine as long as it's getting through, right? It's about the bigger agenda. It's about creating a more equitable sort of Aotearoa and MB. So I think it is about, yes, keep talking, keep saying those things, keep raising it at the right level, but also find your people that will help you navigate the system.
Thank you so much. I love some of the phrases that you used there. Was it institutional readiness?
Organizational readiness, but institutional is fine too.
Yeah. So how willing is your organization to actually listen to concerns of racism? Yeah, I just wish that people took racism as seriously as they do being accused of being racist. There was another really interesting one that I was keen to pose to the group, which says, what do you say when white women leaders, for example, who are threatened when a lack of women of colour is pointed out in leadership teams, and they reply by saying, it's not just about ethnic diversity, what about disability, sexual orientation, etc. Which sounds to me kind of a lot what we see when our marginalised communities being pitted against one another, as if it's like some competition. Did anyone have any thoughts on that, or have you experienced anything like that where the concerns of your community, and it probably happens quite a lot in the public sector because, broadly speaking, Māori are oppressed. In the public sector, there's more recognition for the treaty probably, or more lip service to the treaty than outside of it. And so, I could see that it being a case where there's emphasis on treaty and Māori rights, but maybe other communities' experiences are overlooked in the process. That might not be one that you want to address, but I was just wondering if anyone had any thoughts around that kind of oppression Olympics that might occur in the workplace. No takers?
I guess something that I have noticed, especially on social media, is that issue of whataboutism. So there's one thing that had happened, but then everyone else is what about this situation? What about this situation? I mean, we don't disregard it. We acknowledge that it's there, but I think there are certain times and places for you to talk about that situation at the appropriate time. Yeah. Priya, do you have something to say?
Yeah, just thinking about how it's never an or, it's an and. Everyone's welcome around the table. And I think that is something that we need to raise as well, is that, yep, there are voices missing around the table. Where are they? Let's make space for them. And it's not either or, it's an and. That's, of course, with inclusion and diversity, it's about all of those that you spoke about, Arama. It's not just about people of color. So it is always about looking out for that missing voice and bringing it to the table.
Were there any questions that you wanted to pose, Nuru?
Sorry, I'm just having a look here. Okay, so I think one question was made by Carol. How do you maintain your authentic sense of self without being swallowed up in the culture and the behaviors of your organization? Does anyone want to start that off? Nikki?
Sorry. It's so important to maintain those things. So that's a really, really good question. I think what I've learned to do in more recent times is being very strategic about what battles I choose to fight, because so many people on this call this will like resonate with so many people on this call, that there are so many things that you could be confronting, raising in terms of issues that pertain to race and things that affect us as employees or as professionals or members of the community. And it can get really, really tiring, and it can be exhausting, and it can cause a lot of fatigue. And so one thing that I've really tried to become disciplined in, and this is not just in my professional life, but in my personal life as well, because there's so much going on in the world right now, is to really be strategic about where you're going to place that energy to fight the fight. And I think that's for your own self-integrity as well as protecting yourself, because this fatigue can cause a lot of burnout, and it can be quite damaging to one's mental health. But what I want to just add really quickly is we've talked a lot, during this kōrero about really, really crucial and important issues. And whilst it can seem negative, I think, like from my perspective, particularly coming from like the legal profession, is that in a relatively short period of time, I've seen a lot of promising, I guess, steps towards progression and being a lot more liberal within the legal profession. As an example, is thinking about early days in my career where I was experienced a lot of racism and discrimination. I would never have thought that that I'd be on a panel like this discussing all the issues that we're discussing, but also very recently I spoke to the heads of the judiciary, so from the Supreme Court, Court of Appeal down to the District Court, Māori Land Court and Employment Court, about how they can be more inclusive within the judiciary. And so, I was able to tell these judges, which was just insane, about the discrimination and racism and exclusiveness that I experienced, particularly as a young Asian lawyer, appearing in their courts. And they were very shocked to hear our stories. And because I spoke on behalf of New Zealand Asian lawyers, and there were other people on the panel as well, they were very shocked to hear these stories. But the fact that at the moment we have a Chief Justice who is willing to lead on these issues and try and make a more inclusive judiciary, I would never have thought 8 years ago that would be the case, and that I would have a safe platform to be able to share these experiences with members of the judiciary. So I do see progress. It seems like promising progress, but yeah, in a relatively short space of time, I'd like to say that, there are some good things happening, at least in the legal profession, and also perhaps more widely as we become more aware of these issues that we've just been discussing.
Awesome, thank you so much for sharing that. I do guess that we are seeing progress, and it's from the things that we're doing now that where we're able to make it happen. Arama, do you have any more questions you want to ask? Sorry, you're on mute.
It's past my bedtime, whānau. Yeah, we are coming towards the end of our time together. There have been some more really great questions and statements. So commenting on around the need to not just focus on women of colour, but disabled women, ethnic queer women, ethnic disabled people. So rather than focusing on wealthy, educated, cisgendered, able-bodied. And yeah, just a lot of really, really great comments that have come through. And, thanks to all the people who have stuck it out for almost 2 hours with us. So obviously, I think that just speaks volumes to the quality of the kōrero that our panelists have shared. I did get a question around, I tried to reply on the chat, but I couldn't, around where to find some of those resources around making complaints about Sarah Ahmed's work. So you can find that on a blog called Feminist Killjoy, which is really great. So check that out. So in summing up, I think it would just be nice to just do a quick round to see if there are any other points that our panelists would like to make before we wrap up for the evening. And maybe that could be just thank you for the comment that came through, and that comment could be around advice that you might have for ethnic women in the public sector. Agnes.
Can you all hear me? Yeah, I'll take me. I just wanted to say, just on that previous question about racism in the workplace and how you raise it, I just really want to emphasize that you should never minimalize how you feel about a situation, and don't overthink it. If you feel that that's what happened, it's real, and so you should never minimalize it. What you should do, well, what I suggest you do is you describe what happened. What happened? How did it make you feel? Because these are unacceptable behaviours, and leaders in your organisation will want to know it and will want to address it because they have a responsibility to address those behaviours because it impacts the culture of the organisation. It's not what people want to see in the public sector. So if you're feeling hesitant about doing it, think about your sister, your brother, your niece, your son, people who you feel responsible for, who you are paving the way for in future job prospects, people who you would want to come and work at your organisation. What sort of organisation is it if you're experiencing racism? So please don't minimise it. You don't even have to be courageous to do it. You just raise it. Just describe in plain English what happened, how it made you feel, so that people can address those behaviours. In terms of the conversation tonight, I thoroughly enjoyed it and thoroughly learnt so much from everyone who shared on the chat, your engaging questions, from everyone on the panel who shared your experiences. I've just learnt so much and enjoyed listening to you all, and I just want to also congratulate the facilitators for the way that you've managed the questions, the engagement, and made sure that everyone has had an opportunity to contribute in the chat rooms as well. So I just want to say thank you, and I want to wish everyone all the best in your careers. And you know, I've seen your names in the chat, so I'm looking forward to seeing and maybe one day being lucky enough to make that face-to-face connection. Well done.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Should we wrap up now, Arama?
Sure. Was there any other closing comments or from the other panelists?
I think I saw Priya.
Oh, Manisha? Yeah. Oh, and Priya.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you very much for this opportunity. It's just been so energizing and enlightening and humbling to be a part of this corridor. And with all the questions that came through, it's just been amazing. So thank you very much for having me here. One of the things that I've been reflecting on as a woman of color leading up to this panel discussion is about how our journey as women of color didn't begin here, and it didn't begin now. You know, it's a story of generations of resilience, of resilient, courageous, and badass women in our families who have carved this path for us. So I think in times when we feel a bit hopeless, it is about zooming out a little bit and looking at what are some of the protective factors that our ancestors have given us, you know, and dig deep into that and find the courage and find the resilience in that. Kia kaha, everyone, and thank you very much for this opportunity again. Ngā mihi nui.
Just to add a big ngā mihi nui from me as well. Thanks so much for the opportunity to listen, to learn, and to contribute to the discussion tonight. I probably just want to build off one of the things that Priya just said around ancestors, and I think for so many women of colour, we come from communities that place a lot of value in honouring our ancestors, and I think there's really something about thinking about all of the women that have come before us, both like outside of, but really importantly in our families, that allow us the opportunities to be in kind of the roles and the kind of the way of life that we get to lead and the opportunities that we have today. Sometimes I think about where I am and I think I'm like my ancestors' wildest dreams, like in terms of some of the way I get to live my life as a female in New Zealand. And I guess I want to say, you know, like a career in the public sector is at times it's really hard, and you know, tonight we've talked about lots of different experiences of how it can be really hard, and it builds your resilience. But I guess I want to just make a plug for the public sector as well, you know, and the spirit of service and the reason that so many of us are here in the public sector, and there's so much opportunity to have impact and make meaningful change through the different roles that we have within the public sector. And so I think at times when you're feeling that sense of hopelessness, I would encourage you to persevere. It is a great place to build a career, and there's much that you can contribute to making the lives of New Zealanders better by working through the public sector. Just a big thank you to Arama and Nurul, who have done a wonderful job of moderating our discussion today, and a big thanks for having me to House of Peace and organising the event.
I just want to tautoko everything that my panellists have said, and thanks so much to House of Peace, our lovely facilitators. This has been a really insightful and inspiring kōrero for me personally as well. The fact that there has been so much interest in it really shows how it's such a topical issue and point at this point in time. And thank you everyone who's been watching. And I've been looking at the chat box every now and again, and that people have just been saying such lovely, very supportive things and comments. Despite, you know, the trials and tribulations that a lot of us have outlined, the challenges and obstacles that might come before you in progressing any sort of career, whether that's in the public sector or not. You know, just based on my personal experience, I think a silver lining may be that I wouldn't have had it any other way. I feel like I'm very privileged to be where I am today, and I'm grateful for the experiences and the knockbacks that I've experienced because of who I am and who I represent. It might be hard, but it will be very worth it. And even the fact that I've been able to meet people on this panelist and hopefully meet new people as a result of this webinar gives me a lot of, you know, it's made me feel really content about the situation. So thank you everyone, and kia kaha.
Awesome. So I guess we should wrap up now. So the event has come to an end, and I would like to say thank you to all the panelists, Priya, Agnes, Manisha and Nikki, for sharing their insightful lived experiences. It's so inspirational and empowering to learn from such phenomenal women in their respective fields. I'm sure that each and every one of us has benefited from learning from the panelists, and the work they have done by being in the roles that they are in will help make it easier for other women of colour as well. I would like to thank Arama for being such a fabulous co-facilitator to work with and collaborate with. I would also like to thank everyone who took their time to join in for today's panel. There were hundreds of people who have signed up, and we are so grateful for the immense interest. This just goes to show that events and talks like this are very much needed. So I would like to lastly thank Dar es Salaam, House of Peace, for driving such an amazing event and bringing all of us together. Please keep an eye on their Facebook and Instagram page, as they will have more events coming up in the future. Now, Arama, would you like to do the closing karakia, please?
Kia ora, Nurul. Unuhia, unuhia, unuhia ki te urutapu nui, kia wātea, kia māma, te ngākau, te tinana, te wairua i te ara takata. Koe ara e runga whakarihia ake ki runga, kia wātea, aira, kua wātea, rire rire hau. Pai mārire.